one of the arguments I try to make is that at the moment, the way we talk about class, we turn class into another form of identity politics. Yeah. So class is counterposed to gender, class is counterposed to race. Actually, you look at the modern working class, they're overwhelmingly brown. And you go into like any factory, any hospital, the people who are cleaning the floors, the people who are doing all of the work, you know, they're multiracial. So the idea that these people who are, you know, overwhelmingly, I don't know, if you go into the meatworks, they're overwhelmingly Muslim. So the idea that they're Islamophobic, it's just crazy. Of course they're not Islamophobic, most of them are Muslims.
A few people coming in, but I think we're mostly here now. Terrific to see so many of you here tonight. Thanks for coming. I'm sure Jeff appreciates it, and Roz. We're really looking forward to this discussion of Jeff's new book, Trigger Warnings. Let me acknowledge that we meet tonight on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I know those words can sometimes sound a bit meaningless, but it's really important. This land was stolen, sovereignty was never ceded, and the struggle for Aboriginal justice goes on today.
I'm really excited and proud to be introducing our panel tonight. And I'm sure many of you, if you don't know them, will know them by their reputations. Jeff Sparrow is a writer, broadcaster and editor, and a former employee of the new International Bookshop. He writes a regular volume for The Guardian, and he's a member of the R Breakfasters and the immediate past editor of Overland. His recent books include No Way But This, and his latest book, which we'll be discussing tonight, Trigger Warnings. But my favourite reads by Jeff was his stunning biography of Guido Baracchi, Communism, A Love Story, and his book, which I think, did you co-author with your sister? Radical Melbourne, which are old but still excellent. In fact, I think Communism, A Love Story is one of the best biographies that I've ever read. I wish I had have written it. Anyway, Jeff's going to be interrogated tonight, but in the nicest possible way, by Roz Ward. And I'm so proud to have shaken this person's hand tonight because I'm awe-inspired by the amount of pressure that sometimes individuals become sort of the touch rod for, and that happened to Roz Ward in her valiant work directing the Safe Schools Coalition in Victoria from 2010 until 2017 when she was at La Trobe University. She sustained, and I'm sure you'll remember, ongoing personal attacks through the public debates about safe schools, and as a result became one of the most well-known Marxists in Australia. So thanks very much to the right. Roz continues to be involved in a range of political campaigns, including having been a long-term activist for marriage equality, for refugee rights, the campaigns against racism and fascism, and most recently as part of the Victorian Socialists. Roz is currently doing a PhD in education at RMIT. Anyway, so it's over to Roz and Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us and for all coming out on a Monday night. All right, let's get straight into it, shall we? All right, so let's talk about, first of all, I guess the context of the book. People will be pretty familiar with, hopefully, what's going on in international politics. There's someone called Donald Trump, who's apparently President of the United States. Brexit is sort of underway, but in an interesting moment, debates about free speech, culture wars, all of that kind of stuff. Is there any of that you want to talk about? See, I'm good at this, aren't I? Talk about any of that.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Actually, this book was commissioned by Scribe in the wake of the 2016 election, because that election, I think, was a shock to lots of people, that here is this odious figure, a figure who couldn't be designed to be more odious than he is, who won the American election. And that year, of course, Pauline Hanson returned to Australian politics. So there was clearly something going on. So it was originally supposed to be a book about Trump. And as I started working on it, I quickly realised that people are going to be very sick of people talking about Trump very soon, and that there wasn't enough to sustain a book about that. But the question of political correctness, the question of identity politics and the issues around that have been something I've been thinking about for a while. And I think we all know this is not necessarily the happiest debate to engage in. It's a subject about which people feel very strongly for obvious reasons, and it's a debate that can often become very heated and sometimes vitriolic, to the extent that very often these are subjects that people don't really want to engage in because they think it's going to be sort of nasty and bruising. So there are a lot of people, I think, who have things to say about these subjects, but perhaps think twice about it before engaging in them. But I feel like 2016 was a little bit of a wake-up call around that, because, you know, it was clear that year, if it wasn't already clear, that politics in the world today is fairly serious. You know, there's just been a new climate change report that's come out that makes it clear that unless something very radical happens very, very soon, great swathes of the planet are going to become uninhabitable. You know, we're talking about polarisations of wealth that haven't existed throughout the entirety of human history and now becoming commonplace throughout Western societies. And in this context, it's a context in which the ideas of the left are more important than they've ever been before, are more urgent and more relevant. But one of the things that became apparent in 2016 was that not only was the left not making breakthroughs in a context that you would think would suit the ideas of the left, a period in which most people are profoundly disengaged and profoundly unhappy with the status quo, yet left-wing ideas weren't getting any purchase. But increasingly, it was the far right that was taking up a rhetoric that had previously been associated with the left. The most obvious example of that, I guess, is the idea of elitism and anti-elitism. And if you say that today, you sound like fucking Milo or someone. But, you know, this is a core idea of the left. The notion that social inequality is a bad thing. The notion that a small percentage of society control most of the wealth, the 1%, as we said back in the anti-corporate movement. And yet this was an idea that was becoming associated with the right and not the left. And so that was kind of the impetus for the book, I guess, this sense that the left wasn't making gains in a period in which the left should be. And I mean, Roz and I were talking about this at the pub before we came here, so apologies if this discussion sounds a little bit like we spent too long at the pub. But one of the... in fact, I've just forgotten what it was. Well, what did I just say? One of the problems, I think, is that the right has a confidence with these ideas that were previously associated with the left. And I'm not trying to suggest that coming up with a correct position or coming up with a better understanding of identity politics, the issues around it, is some sort of magic solution that will propel the left into power. That would be an idiotic idea. But I do think it's an area in which we are bogged down in debates that we are very often not winning, and so it's important to try and rethink those arguments, if only because at the moment we are being distracted by debates where we're not winning and we're missing the debates where we should win.
Oh, you can't hear down the back? What if I'm like this? Can you hear me now? We just have to speak a bit louder. Okay, well, so just to be a bit more specific about the context, I guess, and around Trump and some of the specific contemporary alt-right phenomena. And I was just saying that now when I go onto YouTube, unfortunately, down the side of recommended videos, I get Jordan Peterson, because I've watched quite a lot of his videos, and I'm really trying to get my head around, what's the appeal of someone like him? And you talk about the intellectual dark web, which might be a new kind of idea for people, or it might not be, or you might be trapped slightly in that, as I am. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the alt-right and the appeal of people like Jordan Peterson and others who are telling young men to tidy their rooms? And, you know, like Donald Trump saying in the wake of Kavanaugh and all of that, that, like, the group of people who should be most worried in American society are young men right now, you know, those kind of ideas, which clearly do have an appeal, that get a crowd cheering and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was at the March for Men a few weeks back doing a piece on it at The Guardian, and it wasn't a very large event, but it was kind of striking the way that these debates about masculinity have become so central to the far right, that they were able to organise perhaps 500 people to this event. Jordan Peterson is a really interesting example of the phenomenon that I'm talking about. How many people here have read his book, The 12 Rules for Life? Has anyone read it? Yeah, read some of it. You can find it at any airport. If you're waiting for a plane, just read it in the bookshop rather than giving him the money for it. But it's a really interesting example of this phenomenon because he's an arch-reactionary figure. You know, he's someone, he was formerly a fairly obscure psychology professor who came to prominence by his refusal to correctly gender someone in Canada. That was the event that propelled him to fame. And since then, he's become phenomenally popular and successful. I think his Patreon earns him something like $1 million a month. This is just people pledging him money so he can continue his work. And that book is a really interesting project. In some ways, it's completely reactionary. It's, you know, it's a theory of human nature that's based on observations about fucking lobsters, you know, and how the male lobster behaves to the female lobster. You know, the scientific value of it is almost zero. But at the same time, you can kind of see how it works, and you can kind of see the appeal that he's making to disenfranchised young men, because in some respects, this is a book that makes a series of arguments that previously the left would have made. So it offers people a theory of meaning. It offers them something to believe in. It makes arguments about universal values. It makes arguments about morality. It makes arguments about discipline. And these are all previous values that previously would have been associated with the old left. And you can see how there's a coterie of particularly young men who feel that in 21st century capitalism, their lives have no meaning and no value, and are latching on to this grab bag of reactionary nonsense because we're not providing a better alternative to them. And when you put it like that, you know, it's kind of quite sobering. It's easy simply to dismiss these people as buffoons, and Peterson is a buffoon. I mean, I think one of the good lines in the many reviews of that book, he's a stupid person's idea of what a smart person is like. You know, it's this sort of farrago of kind of pseudoscience on the basis, you know, to justify prejudices and traditional conservative ideas. But at the same time, there are a lot of people in the 21st century who feel that society is not working for them. And these are people who traditionally we on the left would be reaching, and when we're not reaching them, these people are being weaponised by the Jordan Petersons of the world. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but I think that's a good place to start, that if we walk away from this field of battle, then other people will walk onto it.
Yeah, if people notice I'm looking up, it's because there's giant drips coming that just landed on my laptop, and it's a beautiful historic building.
It's like a metaphor.
Is it God? I don't know. All right, well, let's get into some of the arguments you make in the book, because you are making an argument. It's not just a set of observations about the world or something. You're trying to intervene in a way that actually is quite courageous in some ways, in that these are debates that not a lot of people are having, and about identity politics, about trigger warnings themselves, that there's a lot of people, I think, having discussions kind of behind closed doors about what should we really be saying on these questions. And so to me it comes across as a bit of a kind of a critique, with a critique of the left, with some kind of analysis of the right. In some ways it's like, here's how the right have done this really well and the left have fucked it up a bit. And I'm kind of interested in that part of it. And one of the observations you make is about how the idea that there's like a backlash, sort of the Cold War ends and then we get into these culture wars, and it's sort of a backlash against what the left has achieved, or what kind of mass politics, direct politics has achieved. And that's a part of it, but at the same time it's sort of a false backlash. And that's kind of something I'm interested in because of my experiences and the way that already it's sort of framed in academia as this backlash against, the left has come so far, and now, of course, there's going to be a reaction, and we can kind of feel comfortable with that because we've won so much in terms of LGBTI liberation or something, and now there's a backlash, and that's sort of proves we've done really well. But I'm not sure if that is kind of the case, and that's partly what you're arguing in here, is that the backlash it's sort of an almost invented backlash against the left, particularly in the 80s, why do you need a backlash when you've got neoliberalism? Well, maybe you need to invent one because you have to push through all these anti-working class policies, all of these neoliberal economic reforms under Reagan and Thatcher, that if working class people were too conscious of all of what that was about, they would probably resist. Whereas if you introduce all of these ideas about culture and race and gender and identity and sexuality, then we can talk about that while all the neoliberal stuff just carries on. So that idea of like, how much is an actual backlash and how much is an invented backlash?
Okay, there's a lot in that. There's pretty much a PhD thesis in that question. But a couple of things. I extracted a section of this book for The Guardian a few weeks back, talking about the idea of smug politics, which is a concept I talk about in the book. The idea that, particularly in the 2000s, what the left came to mean for many people was a series of condescending intellectuals who presented ordinary people as the problem, responsible for most of society's ills, whereas in a previous generation, the people had been presented as the solution to racism and sexism. Increasingly by the 2000s, there was a consensus arising that the people, however you define that, were the source of racism and sexism and transphobia and whatever, and had to be monitored and kept under control. And I think that's a valid argument. The problem is, when you make that argument, there are a lot of people who take you as reiterating a common argument that's made by the populist right, where I don't know if anyone saw the story that was just breaking in the news today about Kimberly Kitchens, a figure from the Labor right here in Victoria, saying that she's founding a faction in the Labor Party to defend Western civilization. And she's saying that this is going to be a faction based on the quiet wisdom of the working class. And the idea is that the working class is innately conservative, innately sexist, innately backward, and the problem has been that liberal do-gooders have been trying to tell working class what to do, trying to tell working class people what to do. Instead, what left-wing politics, or what Labor right politics should entail is simply embracing this notion of the working class as backward and these ideas, these backward ideas of the working class being good. So you find yourself in a strange position where I've written this article denouncing smug politics. In her press release, she was denouncing smug politics, even though from a completely different perspective. So in the book, I talk about how this notion of the working class as innately conservative was developed by neoconservative intellectuals in the 60s, explicitly as an alternative to the traditional left-wing idea of the working class as the font of progressive values. So the traditional left-wing idea is that the working class is the class of progress, the working class is the class of freedom, the working class is the class that will overturn society's iniquities. In the 60s, the neocons begin to argue that in fact the working class are the class of traditional values, the working class are the class of traditional sexual morality, homophobia, and so on, and they're counterposed to a new class elite. You know, this idea of the sort of the inner city elite with their drinking their coffee, their cafe lattes and lecturing ordinary people. So there are two versions of class floating around in these debates, and I think it's really, really important to try and distinguish them between the traditional old left notion of class as a material concept, a concept about the kind of work that you do, and this neoconservative idea of class being something about the ideas that you have in your head. So that's kind of really fundamental to this debate, and it's perhaps a little bit clearer in the book than the explanation I just gave there. But the other argument that I try to make, which relates to the question that you posed, is to do with the relationship between neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Anyone who lived through the 2000s would remember that strange alliance between, on the one hand, these socially conservative figures who were for family values, were for traditional religion, were for racism and homophobia and all these old values. These people were then aligned with neoliberals who were for market values. And when you try and tease that out, it seems very, very strange because, in fact, if you're for the neoliberal idea of injecting the free market into every aspect of human life, if you inject, say, the free market into, say, sexuality, you end up with pornography. So how is it these people who are obsessed with counteracting pornography are aligned with people who think that market forces should determine all our attitudes towards sexuality or religion? It seems like this strange contradiction. And the argument I make, it's not my argument, but it's an argument that's around and I think is worth reiterating, is that there's this strange virtuous circle that the right develops, that when you introduce neoliberal reforms, when you introduce deregulation, privatisation, market values into every aspect of human life, because these values are so alien to the way that most people live, because they're so counterintuitive to human values, the notion that we are no more than a cash nexus, that we are no more than market interactions is so fundamentally hostile to most people's moral intuitions, there is inevitably a backlash against these ideas. And one form the backlash can take is a retreat into social conservatism. If you're feeling that your life is, that you can't get a job, if you're feeling that all of the moral certainties that you had previously taken for granted are being dissolved by the forces of the market, one way that you can find meaning in your life is to retreat into religion, to retreat into sort of traditional conceptions of sexuality or whatever. And so you get this strange virtuous circle where neoliberal reforms create a social anxiety which then fosters this neoconservative backlash, which encourages people to vote for neoliberal candidates who then introduce more neoliberal reforms, which then creates more of a conservative backlash. And we saw that all through the 2000s, this strange situation where, you vote for John Howard because you're hostile to the gays, and then John Howard gets into power and, in fact, pornography is everywhere. You know what I mean? Like, you vote for a conservative candidate because you think that Hollywood is too permissive, and, in fact, your local movie industry gets swept away by the Hollywood juggernaut because market forces are unleashed that wipe away national industries. Do you see what I mean? There's this strange kind of circularity that for a long time worked as a kind of virtuous circle for the right.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a problem definitely for the left. I'm just, I got a quote from that Labor Senator thing today, which was, of course, in the Australian reported, so you probably, hopefully you don't subscribe to that, but yeah, Kimberly Kitching, a close ally and friend of Bill Shorten, is moving to create a bipartisan parliamentary group that will defend Judeo-Christian and Western liberal democratic values as she launches her credentials as a new style of social conservative within the Labor Party. The Victorian, who was controversially handpicked by the opposition leader to replace Stephen Conroy, said she considered it part of her job to fight smug elitism and would seek to ensure the views of inner city elites did not prevail over the quiet wisdom of working people. So, like, all of, you know, it's in terms of traditional party organisation, the idea that, you know, there are social conservatives on the right in the Liberal Party and then there's the left and they're all progressive, obviously, is not the thing. And even just the sort of, the way that the working class is kind of instrumentalised around these ideas of, like, this is why we have to kind of ignore particular issues that are important to left-wing intellectuals or whatever, like racism or something, as if this is not something that working class people care about and campaign about and actually understand a lot better than left-wing intellectuals or, you know, small L liberals and all of that kind of stuff. And even the kind of left nationalism that supports ideas about who is the working class in Australia, you know, like Aussie battlers who are all sheep shearing still or something, or live in country towns or work in car factories or whatever. That's the absolute minority of the working class in Australia today. And even your example in the 60s in America of, like, when some of the new left decided that they would go and reach out to workers and they all got their hair cut and dressed as squares and then go to these factories, and then the workers who all have long hair and earrings are like, what are you like? They thought they were narcs trying to find information on them smoking pot and all this kind of stuff. It's like these kind of divides and definitions of, like, you know, what constitutes class and what constitutes the working class are absolutely tied up in this. And I think you can see that in the debates in the wake of how the fuck did Trump get to be the American president, the leader of the free world, is still, it's almost a debate about, wait, what is the working class in America? Who are they? Where do they live? What do they do? What does it look like today? And it's sort of, most people are 50 years out of date. And the debates about the white working class, when, you know, projections show that how long is it until 50% of the American working class is people of colour? Not very long. I can't remember exactly, but it's not very long away. You know, and that kind of, I think that's really the crux of it, is the debates that are, well, there's oppression on the basis of identity. That's really important. That's the thing we need to be concentrating on. And then, well, actually, it's about class and it's about who's working class and how we respond to their kind of material needs and ideas that are related to that, which to me is a false dichotomy, but it's definitely the framing of the debate. And I think that's the thing about identity politics. As much as it's a term that means 100 things to 100 people, to be honest, like if we did a survey of what does identity politics mean in the room, people would say a bunch of different things. But the idea that the primary category of resistance should be around individual identity, I would say, is my definition of identity politics, versus, well, then what's the role of class in that? And there's elements of the left who go, you know, overcompensate in some ways, or again, base their notions of what the working class is on 50 years out of date, but by arguing that, it has to be class first and oppression is secondary or a distraction and that kind of stuff, which is wrong. And then on the other hand, as a response to that, well, no, if you don't tackle oppression, then how can you ever, unify the working class to... Well, actually, no, they don't really argue that. I would argue that. But, the identity politics side of things of like, well, class reductionism doesn't recognise all the other forms of oppression is the argument. So in some ways, you're, in some part in this book, although it's about a lot of different things that intersect with that, trying to address some of that divide. Yeah.
Yeah, so if I get one thing across about this book, hopefully it's about the potential of ordinary people, because I think that's fundamental to the way that this debate is presented today. It's taken for granted by both a lot of the left and certainly the right that ordinary people in Australia are backward and stupid and right-wing and prejudiced. And in the book, I go back to the origins of the social movements that shape the way we think about politics today. The movements against racism, the movements against sexism, the movements against homophobia. And almost without exception, those movements are based on what I call direct politics. That is, those movements are based on ordinary people taking action to fight against racism and sexism and homophobia. If you look at the modern gay liberation movement, the key moment is Stonewall, the Stonewall riots in New York. This is not about scholarly professors writing papers about homophobia. It's about drag queens and street people fighting back against cops. If you look about the origins of women's liberation in Australia, the first major mobilisation was a trade union march. If you look about the movement against racism in the United States, it's based on people living in the ghetto. And these ordinary people who shape the way that we think about racism and sexism and all sorts of other forms of oppression have been written out of this argument by a kind of new sort of politics that takes for granted that if you're not sufficiently woke to have done a cultural studies course, then you're innately stupid, you're innately sexist, you're innately racist. And I'm not trying to suggest that every ordinary person in Australia has perfect politics on race or gender or sexuality, but I am suggesting that ordinary people are part of the solution and not part of the problem. And it goes to this question as, what do we mean when we talk about the working class in Australia today? Because most of the time, and I've been doing a little bit of publicity for this book already, and if you talk to any journalist about class in Australia, what they take you to mean is people living in the country, almost without exception. That class is about people living in country towns. When they talk about the Labor Party is losing its class base, what they mean is people in the country aren't voting for the Labor Party anymore. But of course, if you look at, say, the arguments in a country like Europe, if you look at, say, 19th century political economy, it's just taken for granted the working class is a force of the cities. The working class is counterposed to the country. The working class is modernity. The working class is the future, not the past. So if we're talking about class in Australia in a Marxist sense, not a neocon sense, if we're talking about class in terms of people's relationship to the means of production, people who sell their labour power, we're talking about people who do things like work in a call centre. And if you, as soon as you pose the question like that, well, what do people who work in a call centre today think about same-sex marriage? Of course they're for it. What do they think about sort of avant-garde music? Of course they've got 15 fucking nose rings and, of course they're multi-ethnic. Of course they're multiracial. It just goes without saying that. And again, I'm not trying to paint a kind of rose-coloured picture. Mixed in with all of these ideas will be some backward ideas as well. But I think one of the problems that left faces, we've got ourselves into this position where we just casually take it for granted that ordinary people are ignorant and need to be educated by us. And that's not necessarily the case. What about if it's the other way around? What about if we need to be educated by the struggles that ordinary people are engaging in?
Well, there's that, and there's also just like the basic kind of function of interest in all of this. Like, for me, the most convincing thing about why you would look to the working class to even enact progressive reforms is because the working class have an interest in challenging and changing the society that we live in a way that the intellectual middle class or the ruling class just does not, and doesn't have an idea in challenging backward, doesn't have an interest in challenging backwards ideas. And that, you know, part of the argument for engaging in struggle is that you learn through that struggle, like, who's on your side and who's not. So, you know, it's a pretty basic thing, but it's like the people who work in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and there's this sort of thing, it's the same with Sydney, that people talk about the working class and then the migrant population as if they're two different things, when they're absolutely not. The migrant population is a massive part of the working class in Australia and should be recognised and embraced and supported, and it's good that, you know, unions like the NUW are doing that work to try to engage with newly arrived migrants and migrants working in all sorts of industries across Australia, that those people have an interest with their white co-workers of being unified around what's happening in their workplace. And, you know, that's like the very education of the strike that is so powerful that you just can't ignore, and all of that kind of stuff that comes from Marxism, which leads me to a question that sort of is my, kind of one of my, as a Marxist, reading this book, like, you're kind of making an argument for quite a lot of the old, I guess, basic socialist ideas, but using words that are not in the kind of socialist lexicon. So where you say direct politics, I would say mass politics, or a movement of the working class, or class struggle even. And where you say, like, talking about different identities, you know, having more strength working together, I would use the word solidarity. Like, it's not the language that you use in the book, and I'm kind of interested in whether that's sort of a decision of the publisher, or if that's about reaching a different audience who can't hear the language of the left in the way that, you know, it makes sense to me, or if there's something else in that.
No, it's definitely not a decision of the publisher. I take full responsibility for that. I guess it's like a strategic decision, you know, and there are pros and cons of either approach. Because I don't use the vocabulary of classical Marxism in this book, even though it's really an argument about classical Marxism, it does lead to a certain conceptual slippage. Do you know what I mean? Some of these terms, in the book I talk about ordinary people. Do you know what I mean? Like, in some respects, this is a nothing term. You know, what does this mean? It doesn't have the precision of the, you know, of the vocabulary that's been established through the classical Marxist tradition. But at the same time, I guess part of the point about trying to write a popular book like this, is not an academic book, it's a popular book, is to reach people who are outside the ranks of the left. I mean, we're having a meeting here in Trades Hall. When you have this discussion in different settings, the kinds of arguments that come up are quite different and phrased quite differently. And if you start to talk about the proletariat, you're immediately erecting a kind of barrier that you then have to surmount. So, and I guess in some respects, that's what I see that perhaps a book like this can try to do, that there are people out there who perhaps have no contact with the left, who are trying to grapple with ideas about identity politics, ideas around you know, the culture wars. These are the contexts they have with the political debates, and they're struggling to make sense of them. And hopefully a book like this might be some sort of compass to try to push in a kind of left-wing direction. And like I said, there are pros and cons of that debate, but that was the approach that I decided to take.
Yeah. And I guess then that sort of flows into another thing, which is probably like too big of a, and we said this before, but like too big of a question to address in a book like this. But, you know, a part of what divides the left, I guess, is not necessarily, the starting point for that is not necessarily strategy, it's about what's your goal. So sections of the left whose goal is to make a nicer version of capitalism have different strategies based on that, compared to people who think that actually capitalism is the fundamental problem and we need to find a way to get rid of capitalism. Then what are our strategies around that? Whereas this is really a book about strategy without considering that kind of final goal. And I guess you've said to me before as well about how in writing this, it's not a hard-line critique of identity politics. It's an engagement with it in a critical way. That even at that level, there's a fear about, how people will respond, and people have already responded inevitably on Twitter, and and people saying, well, if you don't like identity politics, it's because you're a racist, and what are you, a white man, like cis man, and like, of course you don't understand identity politics. So I guess my last, before we open up to questions, is those two things. They're not really small questions, but like the idea of goals and strategies and the idea of even engaging in this debate with people at this time.
I feel that the first part of it goes back to the previous question. This is not a book that's making an argument for revolution, and that's a deliberate choice. I guess as soon as you do that, then there's a whole other argument opens up about what that entails and what that means and stuff. And in some respects, I think that's not a position you have to take in order to engage with the arguments that I'm making. I feel like there's only so many things that one can take on in a single book. In terms of the second part, which was about people critiquing it, I mean, look, it's not nice to have people call you a racist or a sexist or whatever, but these are kind of serious times. I don't know, like, again, listening to the news today, and the latest climate change report came out, and here are all the scientists saying that without radical action, we are facing temperature rises 3 degrees, 4 degrees, or whatever. Well, who is proposing radical action? So here are all the scientists saying, without radical action, these things are going to happen. Where is the radical action coming from? Which party is proposing it? So, do you see what I mean? Like, we are in this situation where, in a funny kind of way, it's no longer utopian to take radical positions. It's utopian not to take radical positions. We have a consensus of the world scientists saying to us that if we don't take radical positions, large sections of the world are going to become uninhabitable. Now, I mean, what kind of sensible moderation says, oh, well, large sections of the world will become uninhabitable? Oh, well, shit happens. You know what I mean? That things are so bad now that we have to start asking difficult and uncomfortable questions. And, I don't think the decades to come are going to be very nice. Do you know what I mean? Like, and if the worst thing that happens to you is a few people call your names on Twitter, well, you're not doing too badly.
Yep. Or hundreds of people thousands of people.
Whose side are you on?
No, they've already gone me. They can go you. It's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Jane, we've just had Jeff speaking on his latest book tonight. What do you think of that book? You've read some of it, I believe?
Yes, I've read 4 chapters and I've heard him interviewed on a number of occasions, and I think it's an extremely important book in Australia and internationally, particularly in the US, where a lot of the sources for the book come from. And I think it puts on the table some very, very important debates for people who are on the left, in broad left in Australia, and who have been subjected to some extremely naive and politically savage attacks from various elements of the right wing. And so the critique that he develops of right-wing politics and of the ways in which that's been caught up in debates around the culture wars, and the way it's drawn attention away from the material politics associated with neoliberalism and the very, very difficult consequences neoliberalism has had for ordinary, everyday working people, is a very important argument. And I would like to suggest that many people read it, that lots of book clubs read it, and generate some important discussions around it. There's some questions in it that I would like to discuss further with him, and particularly questions around elites and the ways in which the concept of elite has been mobilised in relation to certain people who by and large aren't. And what that's been is a smokescreen for the people who actually are elite, which includes the bankers and the corporate leaders and the political class and so forth. And this is the elite that he is arguing, I think, that the left needs to critique, and that's a very important point to be made.
One of the arguments I try to make is, at the moment, the way we talk about class, we turn class into another form of identity politics. Yeah. So class is counterposed to gender, class is counterposed to race. Actually, you look at the modern working class, they're overwhelmingly brown. And you go into like any factory, any hospital, the people who are cleaning the floors, the people who are doing all of the work, they're multiracial. So the idea that these people who are, overwhelmingly, I don't know, if you go into the meatworks, they're overwhelmingly Muslim. So the idea that they're Islamophobic is just crazy. Of course they're not Islamophobic, most of them are Muslims.
I wonder if you agree with me that actually the powers that be have not actually changed their goals, but that in order to accumulate as much power and manipulate the general population in a particular way, they've actually just taken on board the left rhetoric in a manner that the left hasn't, for some reason, become prepared for.
I certainly think there's a tendency for a rhetoric that originated with the left to be employed in a managerial setting that's increasingly, in the universities in particular, but throughout the higher echelons of most workplaces, there will be a language of, awareness of racism, awareness of multiculturalism that will be employed in a very tokenistic kind of way to create an atmosphere that, these issues are being tackled by the institution, and that will often manifest in terms of concern about the number of people of minorities on boards and so on and so forth. And that's obviously something that we should support for more diversity throughout the entirety of society. But it's one of the arguments that I make in the book, is that when these arguments are being presented exclusively from the top down, it's not surprising when they don't resonate with ordinary people, and it's not surprising that some ordinary people begin to associate these ideas not with causes that they support, but in fact with their enemies. I mean, if the people that you hear telling you about how important it is to be anti-racist are simultaneously the people who are cutting your hours at work or telling you that now your position is going to be casual, it's not surprising that some people begin to associate these ideas with everything that they hate. And that is part of the framework by which the right-wing attack on political correctness gets some kind of currency, because when you hear this rhetoric coming from a managerial class, it's easy to think that anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-transphobia is simply a rhetoric that's being used to do you down. Now, of course, that's not true, but that's part of the argument that I've tried to make.
You mentioned this thing about when you talk to journalists about, say, working class.
Yeah.
They'll automatically think that in the Australian context, this is country people. I was brought up in the country. I just find that incredible, that that's how they should analyse the different classes. I don't understand why they see the country in that way, because the country has always been underpaid in comparison to the city. They are beholden to small employer groups. They're constantly being attacked in a whole lot, disempowered, as it were. So the idea that they should personify the working class in Australia just seems really odd to me. And the other one is the thing, on the other hand, where you've got a whole lot of working class, what I'd call working class people in general, believing that they're middle class in Australia.
I think those two things are related. The question about the association between rural Australia and the working class is to do with Australia's history as a colonial settler state. It's not an argument that comes up in the same way in Europe, where the working class was always counterposed to the peasantry. You know what I mean? The working class was the urban class. In Australia, of course, because of its history as a white colonial settler state, the early industries were predominantly rural. So, capitalism was set up through agriculture. So, the foundation of the Labor Party was very much associated with things like shearers and itinerant.
And Australia's place in the international economic world as a hole in the ground, or as a producer of... that
was always more symbolic than real, because very early on the cities in Australia became more important than the countryside. But this was this sort of site of early capitalist production. And then the second aspect of it, of course, is the decline of the labour movement and the union movement means that when people think about working class life, the images and the iconography that come to mind are predominantly nostalgic. So people think about the working class as it existed in the 1950s. They don't think about, say...
Well, they also call the bush the desert.
Yeah. So they don't think about... No one talks about, say, IT workers in terms of the working class. And... that's partly because, I guess, there's not a tradition of unionisation in those sectors. There's not a tradition of strike action or whatever. But in terms of, not owning the means of production and selling your labour power, this is a classic working class. And as I said in that talk, as soon as you reframe the debate like that, the argument changes entirely. If you think about, code monkeys tapping away on their computers all day long, the idea that workers are backward, the idea that workers are stupid, the idea that workers are,
don't care about the environment.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. That's interesting, because I've been to a couple of meetings of computer workers, IT workers, and some of the things, because there's the beginnings of a move towards unionisation. And one of the key issues that I found really interesting was the ethics of their work. They're very concerned about the ethics of their work.
Yeah. I think when the next upturn comes, I think it's going to take a lot of people by surprise, because the kind of industries in which the working class will be most active won't necessarily be how it looked like in the past. And I think it's really kind of fundamental to this argument. If we're going to have a notion of the working class, it's this sort of sense of the working class as, the class of the future, not the class of the past. The class that is more highly educated than it's ever been before. It's more international than it's ever been before. It's more multiracial. It's more multi-gendered. All of those things. When we talk about like labour organising in the 19th century, we are talking about people, many of whom were illiterate, most of whom hadn't been to school, predominantly male, most of whom had never left a very small geographical area. We talk about the modern working class. None of those things are true anymore.
I know, it's fascinating because we're looking over there in this building. You've got things like the candle soap starch workers.
Yeah, it's a different world. So that's the world of the past. But there's a modern working class that it's not dealing with bloody candlesticks or whatever. It's dealing with information technology. It's dealing with the ephemera of online retailing, like in an Amazon superstore where they're packaging all the parcels or whatever.
Jeff, in the past 12 months, Australia's seen a lot of far-right speakers coming here. Stephen Molyneux, Lauren Southern, Milos Yiannopoulos, Nigel Farage, and there's others coming and later on in the year. Why do you think that's happened? It's something that's sort of really grown in the past 12 months. Is this because generally like the rise of the right and Trump and Brexit, and is it all sort of wrapped up?
I think you have to be a little bit careful about that. In some senses, it's because these people have a profile and acceptability in the mainstream that they previously wouldn't have done. We now have parliamentarians like Fraser Anning who are more or less openly white nationalists in a way that wouldn't have been possible in the past. At the same time, though, I think we also need to recognise one of the reasons these people are coming to Australia is they can't get a gig anywhere else. Like Milo Yiannopoulos is more or less discredited everywhere in the world. He comes to Australia and he's feted as an intellectual and he appears in the press and everything. So, there's a degree of just overt hucksterism. They come here because they can make money.
Okay, and just the protests against these people outside the venues, there's quite often around Australia, around the other capital cities, there's little or no protests, but when it comes to Melbourne, there's massive protests. What is it about Melbourne that you believe engenders these protests?
Melbourne's been a left-wing town since the 70s. I don't really know what the long-term solution to the long-term explanation for that is, except that these things tend to build upon each other. Like if you have a tradition of having militant, vibrant protests, that will continue to encourage militant, vibrant protests in the future. But exactly what's happening in other cities, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Oh no, he's okay. Yeah. I'm not very good at this